I told you she'd never make it, Daniel said, leaning back in his chair as though the divorce had already been won. She couldn't even keep a job. His attorney slid the settlement agreement across the polished conference table. I turned each page slowly while Daniel watched me with a satisfied smile. If you cooperate, he said, this can be over today. No fighting, no embarrassing court battle. You take what you're offered and we both move on. What I was being offered amounted to a few pieces of furniture, my personal belongings, and none of the future Daniel believed I was incapable of building. I picked up the pen. His smile widened. You'll thank me eventually, he added. Maybe this will motivate you to become realistic. I signed. Daniel glanced at his attorney, almost disappointed that I hadn't begged. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and said, I'm ready to find someone who actually has ambition. As he walked out, my phone vibrated beside the unsigned final page. My attorney caught a glimpse of the notification before I turned the screen face down. Is that what I think it is? She whispered. I gave the smallest smile. Daniel had no idea the life he was so eager to abandon had already changed forever. 6 weeks earlier, I had walked into our house carrying a cardboard box filled with 12 years of my career. Daniel was pouring himself a drink when he saw it. What happened? My position was eliminated, I said. The company restructured the engineering division. He stared at me for half a second, then he laughed, not nervously, not sympathetically. He actually laughed. So, they finally figured out what I already knew. I placed the box on the kitchen counter. It wasn't performance-related. My entire team was affected. Of course. He lifted his glass. There's always an explanation with you. I waited for him to ask whether I was all right. He didn't. Instead, he glanced toward the garage where I had spent countless nights developing a manufacturing device after working full days. I knew you'd never make it, he said. Maybe now you'll stop pretending that little invention is going to save you. I looked at the man I had supported through promotions, late nights, and years of business travel. He saw an unemployed wife. He didn't know that 3 days earlier executives from a global manufacturing company had signed a licensing agreement for my patented design. He didn't know the deal was valued at $71 million. And because the agreement remained under a strict confidentiality embargo, I couldn't tell him, not yet. That evening, while Daniel complained on the phone that he was now carrying the household alone, I took a thick folder from my work bag. Licensing agreement. Confidential. I placed it inside the locked drawer of my desk. The key turned just as Daniel's footsteps approached the room. He opened the door and looked at me suspiciously. What are you hiding? I rested my hand on the drawer and met his eyes. Something that would soon prove he had never known me at all. The days after my layoff settled into a routine I never could have imagined. Not because I wasn't looking for another job, but because Daniel suddenly acted as though losing one paycheck had erased everything I had accomplished over the previous 12 years. The first Monday after I cleaned out my office, I woke up before sunrise out of habit. I made coffee, updated my resume, applied for 3 engineering positions. By 8:30, Daniel wandered into the kitchen wearing his expensive suit. He looked at my laptop. Applying already? I'd rather stay busy. He shrugged. Good luck. Companies aren't exactly fighting over unemployed engineers. He grabbed his briefcase and headed for the door. Oh, he turned around with a smirk. Don't spend too much money while I'm gone. The front door closed behind him. For several seconds, I simply stared at it. Not because the comment hurt, because I couldn't understand how the same man I had loved for 9 years could become someone I barely recognized in less than a week. His attitude only became worse. Every expense suddenly required an explanation. When groceries arrived, he'd look through the receipt. Did we really need organic vegetables? When the electric bill came in, you've been home all day. Why is the power bill higher? If I ordered replacement parts for my prototype workshop, he immediately questioned them. Seriously? You're still wasting money on that thing. I calmly replied, those parts were ordered months ago. It doesn't matter. It's still a hobby. A hobby. That single word almost made me laugh. 6 years of research, hundreds of late nights, dozens of failed prototypes, thousands of engineering drawings, 3 patent applications. He reduced all of it to a hobby. If only he knew executives at one of the world's largest industrial equipment manufacturers had spent the previous month negotiating rights to use it. But confidentiality meant confidentiality. Not even my husband was permitted to know until the public announcement. Friday evening, Daniel invited 2 coworkers over for dinner without asking me. I cooked anyway. Old habits die hard. Halfway through the meal, one of them asked politely, "So, Becky, Daniel mentioned your company downsized." I nodded. "Yes." Before I could say another word, Daniel answered for me. They finally figured out engineering isn't really her thing. Both guests laughed politely, unsure whether he was joking. Daniel continued, "You should see the garage." He rolled his eyes dramatically. "She's convinced she's going to invent the next billion-dollar product." One coworker smiled awkwardly. "Well, you never know." Daniel chuckled. "No, trust me. I know." I forced myself to smile, not because I agreed, because correcting him wasn't an option. Every document related to the licensing agreement remained protected by a confidentiality clause. Breaking it would expose me to enormous legal penalties and could jeopardize years of work. So I simply served dessert. Daniel mistook my silence for embarrassment. Later that night, after the guests left, he leaned against the kitchen counter. "You know what your problem is?" I quietly loaded dishes into the dishwasher. "You've always believed talent alone would make you successful. I've worked hard. So have millions of people." He folded his arms. "The difference is I actually succeeded." I looked at him. "Success isn't always visible." He laughed. "There you go again. I've already contributed more than you realize." He shook his head. "No, Becky. You've convinced yourself of that." He walked upstairs, still smiling. He never noticed that I wasn't defending myself anymore. I was simply waiting. The following Tuesday, I needed our home to scan several personal documents for my attorney. Daniel had left his laptop open on the dining room table before rushing out to answer a work call in the backyard. I wasn't trying to snoop. I simply intended to move the computer so I could reach the scanner. Then I saw the screen, a legal document. At the top were the words, "Petition for Dissolution of Marriage." My name, Daniel's name, asset division, spousal support. My stomach tightened. I hadn't known he was considering divorce. He was already preparing it. Before I could read another line, the back door opened. Daniel hurried inside. His eyes immediately locked onto the laptop. Without saying a word, he slammed it shut. "Don't touch my computer." The look on his face told me everything. The divorce wasn't an idea anymore. It was already in motion. 3 days after I discovered the draft divorce petition, Daniel stopped pretending. He no longer treated our marriage as something worth saving. Instead, he acted as though it was already over. One Saturday afternoon, his parents invited us to a family barbecue. Normally, I enjoyed spending time with them, but that day I could tell something had changed before we even sat down. Daniel was unusually cheerful. Too cheerful. As everyone gathered around the patio table, his older brother asked, "So, Becky, have you found another engineering job yet?" I opened my mouth to answer. Daniel beat me to it. "She's still looking," he said with a shrug. Turns out companies aren't lining up to hire someone they just laid off. A few people exchanged uncomfortable glances. His mother offered me a sympathetic smile. "I'm sure something will come along." "It will," I replied calmly. Daniel laughed. "Hopefully before she turns the garage into a museum of failed inventions." A few awkward chuckles followed. No one wanted to encourage him, but no one challenged him either. I simply took another sip of iced tea. If they mistook my silence for agreement, there was nothing I could do about it. The one thing that would have changed the entire conversation remained locked behind a legally binding confidentiality agreement. Over the 2 weeks, Daniel carefully shaped the story everyone heard. Whenever friends asked how we were doing, he answered for both of us. "It's been stressful," he'd say. "I'm carrying everything financially now." At a neighborhood gathering, someone mentioned how difficult layoffs had become in the engineering industry. Daniel smiled as if he were the expert. Honestly, it wasn't just bad luck. Several heads turned toward him. Becky was never really cut out for that level of engineering. He shook his head dramatically. "She's talented at dreaming, though. If imagination paid the bills, We'd be billionaires. The group laughed politely. I stood there holding my drink, saying nothing. One woman looked at me apologetically. I'm sorry. I smiled. It's okay. Because correcting Daniel would require explaining why executives from a multinational manufacturer had been flying me across the country for confidential meetings over the past several months. And I legally couldn't. The divorce papers arrived the following Monday. Daniel didn't even hand them to me himself. A process server knocked on the front door. I'm looking for Rebecca Carter. I'm Becky. You've been served. He handed me the envelope and left. Daniel was sitting in the living room when I walked back inside. He didn't look surprised. I figured doing it this way would avoid unnecessary drama. I opened the envelope. He watched my face carefully. You don't have to worry, he said. I'm willing to be fair. Fair? You can keep your car, your clothes, and whatever's in your workshop. He spoke as though he were making a generous sacrifice. I folded the papers. I'll have my attorney review them. He nodded confidently. I expected that. 2 days later, I sat in my attorney's office reviewing the proposed settlement. She frowned as she read through the documents. Daniel seems convinced you're in a weak financial position. He is. She looked up. Is there anything I should know? There was, but not yet. Instead, I asked the only question that mattered. Has the confidentiality period ended? She checked her notes before shaking her head. No. I leaned back quietly. Then we continue exactly as planned. She studied me for a moment. You understand you can negotiate harder. I know. But I won't. She closed the file slowly. You seem unusually calm for someone going through a divorce. I've spent 6 years learning the value of patience. That evening, Daniel celebrated with coworkers at an upscale restaurant. One of them raised a glass. So, you're really moving on? Daniel grinned. I've wasted enough time trying to motivate someone who never wanted success. His phone buzzed with congratulatory messages about his fresh start. Across town, my own phone vibrated. An encrypted email appeared on the screen. Final regulatory approval received. I opened it just long enough to confirm the sender. Everything had been approved. Everything. I locked my phone and looked across the table at my attorney. She smiled for the first time in weeks. Then she quietly said, everything changes tomorrow. The divorce moved toward completion with surprising speed. Daniel got exactly what he wanted. He moved into a luxury apartment downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, posting pictures online with captions about new beginnings and knowing your worth. Mutual friends congratulated him. Some privately messaged me asking if I was doing okay. Others never reached out at all. I didn't blame them. They only knew the version of the story Daniel had been telling. As far as everyone else was concerned, I was the engineer who had lost her job, watched her marriage fall apart, and quietly accepted the divorce without putting up a fight. That version of me was convenient. It just wasn't true. A few weeks later, I signed the final divorce papers. Daniel barely looked at me during the hearing. He acted as though I were already part of his past. Outside the courthouse, his attorney shook his hand. Congratulations, he said. Now you can move forward. Daniel smiled. I plan to. He walked past me without saying a word. I simply nodded and left with my attorney. Neither of us spoke until we reached her car. She looked at me. One more day. I smiled. I've waited 6 years. I suppose one more day won't hurt. The next morning, while most people were starting their workday, I was sitting inside the headquarters of the manufacturing company that had licensed my invention. The boardroom overlooked an enormous production campus. Several executives stood to greet me as I entered. Good morning, Becky. Good morning. The company's chief executive extended his hand. Congratulations. The embargo expires at noon. Thank you. A financial advisor placed several folders in front of me. Today, we'll finalize the first wire transfer schedule. Another advisor reviewed tax planning strategies. A legal specialist confirmed every regulatory filing had been completed. The licensing agreement was now fully enforceable. Years of engineering, years of patent reviews, years of negotiations, everything had finally reached the finish line. The only thing left was the public announcement. At almost the same moment, Daniel was sitting in a conference room giving a quarterly sales presentation. Halfway through the meeting, one of his coworkers interrupted. Have you seen this? Daniel frowned. Seen what? The industry newsletter. I've been busy. His coworker shrugged. Apparently, one of the biggest licensing deals this year is being announced today. Daniel barely looked up. Good for them. He returned to his presentation. The announcement meant nothing to him. He had no reason to think it did. Shortly before noon, every major trade publication began publishing the same headline: Global Industrial Manufacturer Licenses, Revolutionary Efficiency Technology. The inventor's name was still being withheld until the official press conference. Within minutes, engineering forums exploded with speculation. Whoever had developed the technology had reportedly secured one of the largest private licensing agreements in the sector. Daniel scrolled past the headlines without opening a single article. His attention remained on preparing for lunch with his new girlfriend, Melissa. He'd met her only weeks after filing for divorce. She admired his confidence, or perhaps she admired the version of himself he enjoyed presenting. As they sat in an upscale restaurant, Melissa glanced at her phone. Everyone's talking about some inventor. Daniel laughed. Probably another overnight success. If only he understood how many nights that overnight success had spent alone in a cold garage refining prototype after prototype. At exactly noon, the press conference began. The company's CEO stepped onto the stage before dozens of reporters. Behind him, a massive screen displayed only the company logo. Today, he began, we are proud to introduce the inventor whose technology will fundamentally improve manufacturing efficiency across multiple industries. The screen faded to black. Then a photograph appeared. Mine. My full name filled the screen beneath it. Becky Carter, mechanical engineer, inventor, patent holder. The CEO smiled. Please welcome Ms. Becky Carter. Applause filled the auditorium as I walked onto the stage. Across town, Daniel's divorce attorney was eating lunch alone in his office while skimming the same industry newsletter he'd ignored earlier that morning. The online article had just been updated. The anonymous inventor finally had a name. He stopped chewing, read the headline again, then opened the attached press release. There was no mistake. The smiling woman standing beside the company's executives was Becky. He immediately reached for his phone. Daniel, he said the moment the call connected, you need to leave wherever you are. Daniel frowned. What happened? I've just seen something. What? A long silence followed. Finally, the attorney said quietly, you need to look at the news. Daniel opened the article. His face lost every trace of color. There I was, standing beside executives, holding a signed licensing agreement. The headline below my photograph read, $71 million licensing deal announced. His hands began to shake. This can't be right. It is, his attorney replied. But before Daniel could finish the sentence, his phone erupted with incoming calls, one after another. Friends, coworkers, family members, each asking the same question. Daniel, isn't that your wife? Daniel didn't answer a single call. He couldn't. He sat frozen in the restaurant staring at my photograph on his phone as though it belonged to someone else. Melissa leaned across the table. Daniel. He didn't respond. She picked up her own phone and read the article. Global manufacturer announces exclusive $71 million licensing agreement with inventor Becky Carter. She looked up slowly. Your ex-wife. Daniel swallowed. She never told me. Melissa continued reading. The company says the agreement was executed weeks before the public announcement because it remained under a confidentiality embargo. She frowned. So, this happened before you filed for divorce? Daniel didn't answer because he already knew the answer. Yes, it had. Meanwhile, I stood on stage answering questions from reporters. One journalist raised her hand. Ms. Carter, many inventors struggle for years before receiving recognition. What kept you going? I smiled. The work itself. Another reporter asked, how long have you been developing this technology? Just over 6 years. Were you ever tempted to give up? Many times. What changed? I paused before answering. I stopped measuring progress by what other people could see. The room grew quiet. Then another reporter asked about the confidentiality period. I explained that every stage of the negotiations had been governed by strict legal agreements. The contract prohibited me from discussing the licensing arrangement publicly or privately until every regulatory approval had been completed. So even close family members couldn't know? That's correct. I honored the agreement. By late afternoon, every major business publication had picked up the story. Television interviews followed. Industry experts called the licensing agreement one of the most significant engineering deals of the year. Then the personal side of the story began spreading. People connected the dates. The licensing agreement had already been signed before my employer announced its restructuring. My layoff had nothing to do with my performance. It was simply one position among hundreds eliminated during a corporate reorganization. The narrative Daniel had spent weeks building collapsed in a single afternoon. My phone filled with messages. Some came from former coworkers. Others came from old friends. Then messages from Daniel's family started arriving. His mother wrote first. "Becky, I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry." His older brother sent another. "I should have spoken up at the barbecue." I knew Daniel was being unfair. Even people who had laughed politely at his jokes reached out. One message simply read, "Now I understand why you never defended yourself." The truth was simpler than they imagined. I hadn't remained silent because I was weak. I had remained silent because breaking the confidentiality agreement could have destroyed 6 years of work. No argument was worth risking that. Daniel finally called just after 7 o'clock that evening. I watched his name appear on my screen, then disappear. He called again and again, voicemail. The next morning, another call, then a text. "Please talk to me." Another, "I didn't know." Then another, "We need to discuss this." I never responded. There was nothing left to discuss. He hadn't left because he believed I was unhappy. He hadn't left because our marriage couldn't be repaired. He left because he believed I had become a financial burden. The money hadn't changed who I was. It had simply revealed who he was. A week later, my attorney invited me into her office. She closed the door behind us and smiled. "I've had 3 calls from Daniel's attorney." What did he want? He asked whether there was any possibility of reopening the settlement. I almost laughed. And I reminded him of something. She opened the divorce file. He negotiated these terms. She pointed to Daniel's signature. He insisted on them. She turned another page. "You accepted them." She closed the folder. "The agreement is final." I nodded. "I thought so." He also admitted something. "What?" He said they built their entire strategy around the assumption that you had no meaningful future income. I smiled faintly. That assumption was expensive. Because the licensing agreement had already existed before the divorce proceedings, even though it remained confidential, I had complied with every legal obligation. I had disclosed exactly what the law required. Nothing more, nothing less. Daniel received precisely what he had demanded during the negotiations. No judge had treated him unfairly. No one had deceived him. His own arrogance had done all the damage. Months passed. Life became wonderfully quiet. Instead of buying a mansion or filling my garage with luxury cars, I purchased a comfortable home with enough land for a proper engineering workshop. For the first time in years, I had space to build without worrying about hiding receipts or explaining why another prototype component had arrived. I hired a small team of engineers, not to chase another fortune, to solve problems that mattered. I also established a scholarship fund for young inventors who couldn't afford patent filings or prototype development. Too many brilliant ideas disappear because talented people run out of resources before anyone believes in them. I wanted to change that. Every time we awarded a scholarship, I remembered the nights I sat alone in that cold garage wondering whether anyone would ever see value in my work. As for Daniel, I heard about him only through mutual acquaintances. His coworkers never forgot the confidence with which he had declared, "I knew she'd never make it." Those words followed him far longer than he expected. People stopped asking him for relationship advice. Some quietly questioned his judgment. Others remembered how eagerly he had mocked the very woman whose success became international news. His reputation wasn't destroyed by my achievement. It was damaged by his own words. One evening, I walked into my workshop after everyone else had gone home. On the wall hung the framed patent certificate that had started everything. Not the licensing agreement, not the newspaper headlines, not photographs from the press conference. just the patent. A reminder that success begins long before the world notices. I looked at it for a long moment and smiled. The $71 million had given me freedom, but it wasn't the greatest thing I had earned. The greatest invention I ever created wasn't the one worth $71 million. It was finally believing my future never depended on someone else's opinion,